which is transitional justice practitioner, but a human rights activist as well. Jimmy, we are glad to have you here today. And Jimmy will be presenting a topic titled, How Climate Change Impacts Transitional Justice. Our second panelist of the day is Professor Barnard Lututala. He is from the Department of Population and Migration Studies from the University of Kinshasa, DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo. And this being a regional conference, it's very timely that we have someone from the region. Mr. Lututala will be taking us through climate change as the change that would set many migratory changes in motion. And he is going to be online, and like our day manager mentioned, we hope that the network will be steady so we can have very fruitful engagements from him. So I know that we are late, we're running behind schedule, and our online participants, we apologize for that, but we are going to be able to catch up. Jimmy, right now I am going to give you approximately 20 minutes to take us through your presentation. Thank you very much. The attention is all yours.
I'll stand at the podium. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. That sounds better. It's a pleasure to stand here again. For those who were here yesterday, I stood here the entire day. Today I come under a different shade as an intervener in one of the topics. I've been introduced, and it's a pleasure to speak to you on this pertinent topic. I'll be looking at, can I have the pointer if possible? Or just click next. My topic is not seen. I've looked at climate change impact on transitional justice. You know, at this point in time, I'm very sure we all have an idea of what climate change is. You know, from the from the opening remarks through the other presentations, they've been defining climate change in different ways. So I'll move away straight to something else. I want to go through the definition. It is clear, ladies and gentlemen, that climate change is undoubtedly a defining issue of our time. This has come out very vividly from many presenters. It has immeasurably devastated the world with effects that are symmetrical in nature. They are asymmetrical in nature in a way that they affect different people differently. The rich are affected differently, the poor are affected differently, and yesterday Dr. Chris took us through other gender dimensions of climate change. You realize the men have another way that affected women and others. So the effects of climate change are asymmetrical. They affect people differently. This change has ravaged humanity in all angles, irrespective of the color, of their nationality, irrespective of their gender. And one thing that is very clear is that it acutely affects the most vulnerable differently, and owing to things like geography, poverty, age, status, and so on. That said, you realize that Africa is not comparable to any other continent in terms of the ramification of climate change. And one of the reasons is because it almost entirely depends on rainfall for agriculture and its long history of inequalities. And realize that this agriculture is, in most economies, is the backbone of the continent. So if agriculture is affected, it means employment is affected, it means income is affected, and it has a direct correlation to rising tensions that at the end of the day lead to conflicts. A lot has happened. Recently we had the conference of parties taking place, but realize that these conferences of parties and their resultant agreements and the different conventions, they've done a lot to build momentum for global climate action. But it's also very clear that the depth of action needed requires more cooperation than before. Just a month ago, this very year, a report was released by the Emissions Gap, and it indicates that we are on track towards a global catastrophic temperature situation. The temperature, it's estimated that by the end of the century, if nothing deliberate is done, the temperature will have risen to 2.7 degrees Celsius, which is far, far, far above the 1.5 limit that the Paris Agreement is advocating for. So that means the momentum built by the different parties needs to be either doubled or tripled. Otherwise, we are doomed, we are headed for a catastrophe. You realize that climate disruption is no longer a distant threat. It's something that we are living with. It's something that is affecting our lives and our livelihoods, especially those that are most vulnerable. Just last week, there was a conference, there was a meeting, a high-level meeting of Caring for Climate 2021, where the Secretary General was quoted to have said decarbonizing is not only the right thing to do, but the smart thing to do. He went ahead and warned that we are not moving far enough, fast enough. Temperatures are still on the rise, and this is so, so dangerous. So all these tie in with what the earlier presenters were saying. It's time to act. The time is now. Enough with the rhetorics. Because the indicators are showing that if we do not take action, we are headed for doom. You realize that climate change is not only an environmental problem. It's a public health issue. It's a threat to national security. It's an economic challenge of considerable magnitude. And this means that we therefore need to shift our attention. We need to shift from weighing the evidence, how much has been destroyed, how much is likely to be destroyed. That we are weighing the evidence. We need to now shift our focus to what can we do to avoid any further destruction. Looking at Uganda context, lots of examples were shared. You know, people have talked about landslides. Just before we broke off for lunch, we had a survivor's testimony here. We've had landslides, not only in Bududa. You know, we had one from Bududa, but we've had landslides all over the country. People in Bulambuli, which is also part of the Elgon area. People in Kwen, which is in Sebei sub-region. In southwestern Uganda, Bundibujo, Toroko, Kasese, all these have had their fair share of the impact of climate change. We've had floods disrupting a lot of things. Floods in Kasese, floods in Nakasongola. And recently I was in Kasese 2 weeks ago, where the hospital used to be in Klembe. It's no longer a hospital, it's just something else. It has been shifted somewhere in town. And we've seen earlier on our survivor testimony, it showed how health centers were equally disrupted, and all these have their own negative impacts. Of course, recently we've had rising water levels around almost all our water bodies. Lake Choga, the other side, had people around it have their fair share. Lake Albert had its water levels rising. Lake Victoria here had water levels rising to levels that were last recorded in 1962. And all these, we agree, are impacts of climate change. This map, I'm not moving at the same pace with my colleague there. Shafiq. Well, the map tries to just paint a picture that, at our level in Uganda, we've had almost all these districts have their different catastrophes, ranging from slides to floods to drought to famine and so on and so forth, all caused by climate change. And these are some of the pictures. My brother here was talking about, in Ududa. Shafiq? They're just pictorials trying to show. I was struck when the landslide happened in 2018. We went for an impact assessment, just try and understand the impact of the landslide, and that's why I got some of these pictures. It is catastrophic. Each time I hear of landslide, there's a story of a lady that has never gone off my mind. She narrated a story how their only daughter, they had struggled to push her up to senior 4, was about to sit for her exams, and she was sent home to pick the remaining balance of the fees. So the family chooses to sell the cow, the only cow they had in the home, to see that they raise the remaining balance, and their daughter sits for exams. And this family had scheduled to have their wedding in the December of the same year. So the mother and the father go to the center. It was a market day. They sell their cow, they pick the money. It was 950,000. So the husband picks 200,000, gives the wife and says, go home, I'll still keep around the center and catch up with my friends. The landslides came and found the man in the center. The man died. The money was lost. And that was the end of education for that lady, for that young girl who was supposed to sit for examinations. So to that lady, the damage is irreparable, And there are so many other survivor stories. When you listen to them, they're heartbreaking. What's the implication of all this? There's been profound harm, including loss of lives. We've seen long dry spells in so many places. We've seen livestock die. There's a point in time when cows were being sold so cheaply around Nakasongola because they were dying. One of the impact of climate change. We've seen cattle rustling, insecurity, destruction of infrastructure. We've seen displacements and so on. And now that brings me to my bigger topic, the other side of the story, transitional justice. This is something that we do every day, only that sometimes we do it without knowing that we are actually practicing transitional justice. Transitional justice is simply defined, according to the UN Secretary General's report, as a full range of processes and mechanisms associated with a society's attempt to come to terms with a legacy of large-scale abuses in order to ensure that there is accountability, serve justice, and achieve reconciliation. Of course, it's a combination of both judicial and non-judicial processes. The African Union TJ policy that was adopted in 2019 has its own definition, which is not very, very far away from what the UN defines TJ as. The African Union policy defines TJ as the various formal and traditional or non-formal policy measures and institutional mechanisms that societies, through an inclusive consultative process, adopt in order to come to terms with past violations, divisions, and inequalities, and to create conditions for both security and socio-economic transformation. In both these definitions, you realize that the element of society is very key. It has to be a concerted effort of a society to come together and make attempts to come to terms with what happened to them. This has been so applicable in the conflict context, but trust me, a lot happens whenever there's a catastrophe, whenever there's a disaster that is similar to what happens during conflict. The Uganda National Transitional Justice Policy, also passed in 2019, June, defines TJ not any different from how the UN Secretary General's report of 2004 defines it. People have had different thoughts of what they think TJ is. There are those who say it's the deliberate steps that are taken to heal a community. So these steps are not accidental, they are deliberate. Something is deliberately done to heal a community or a society. TJ confronts a number of challenges. It looks at how does a society build or restore human dignity? How does a society heal the wounds? How does it mend the fractured relations and restore a rule of law? How do we build a culture of human rights? How do we nurture democracy? So TJ, which is Transitional Justice, confronts all these challenges. Desmond Tutu and others during the South African Truth Commission, they defined TJ as a window of opportunity to close the book. And others look at it as a society sitting in judgment of itself. So those are some of the definitions of TJ that are very, very important for us to understand before we can begin linking it to climate change. TJ is aimed at enabling purposeful transitions from periods of injustices into more peaceful regimes. And history has it that recently there were estimates that counted over 1,500 individual transitional justice mechanisms that have been used in over 60 countries. Unfortunately, this vast experience used in conflict experiences and conflict scenarios has never been systematically examined to see what lessons, if any, can be borrowed and applied in the context of climate change. In other words, so much work has been done around TJ, but in conflict contexts, and so little has been done in the context of climate change. TJ experiences therefore can provide insights for navigating the difficult territory between recognizing the complex, historically rooted justice claims and a future that demands solidarity and collective action, especially around climate change. So there's a huge missing link between the available TJ processes, the available TJ mechanisms, and their applicability in the area of climate change. But that does not mean that they are totally different, conflict and climate change. In other words, the climate change could also be, is also a conflict with nature, and so on and so forth. So there are interdependencies between these two. So despite the differences in the context, climate change dilemmas share a lot of similarities with conflicts in which transitional justice has been so useful. For instance, in both scenarios, there is an unavoidable interdependence and potential costs for all the parties of not finding an agreement. You'll agree with me that there is that debate between the developed countries that the greatest contributor to the carbon emission, and the developing countries are saying, well, we don't contribute that much, but we are suffering the most impact of your activities. So there's that potential cost for parties of not finding an agreement. So there must be an agreement between these parties. And TJ comes in to shed light on how such agreements can be arrived at. There's that deep disagreement about how the past should relate to the future in a transition period that requires solidarity. So in both scenarios, there is that disagreement. In both scenarios, there's the presence of profound loss. When conflict happens, property is destroyed, lives are lost, and so much is at stake. So the same thing happens when there is a catastrophe or a disaster. In both, of course, yesterday we had lots of presentation about the existing legal instruments, both at international level, regional level, and local level. But these processes have not been adequate enough in addressing the scope and the types of injustices and harms involved, especially with climate change. As I move towards the end, TJ has pillars. As you may remember from the definition, they said a full range of processes and mechanisms that are associated with the society's attempt to deal with the legacies of a large-scale abuse. In this case, these mechanisms are also associated with a legacy of dealing with a climate catastrophe if it happens. One of them is prosecution. Yesterday, Professor Emmanuel here talked about how a case between Mbabas and others versus Attorney General, how it has, I can't even tell why it is, you know. But these are very great cases. If at all they were expedited, we would have justice, climate justice prevail. Truth-telling is another very important mechanism that has worked in transitional justice. And here we're saying that there are lots of commissions and there are lots of omissions that happen. And who is behind this? Who are the perpetrators? So truth-telling can come in handy to find out some of these details. If at all we had a truth-telling commission, I don't know how I would call it. Do we call it a carbon-free truth commission or something like that? But these are very important options that have not been explored, but are very critical in understanding exactly who did what, who failed to do what, that has caused the catastrophe the world is living with. Reforms. Earlier in the day, NEMA and others were on the spotlight for a lot of things that perhaps have not been done rightly. You know, reforms of institutions is very key as a measure of enabling communities come to terms with legacies of an abuse or a catastrophe occasioned by climate change. So institutional reforms become a very, very major pillar. It becomes a very key mechanism that can be explored to see how societies get to terms with what happened to them. Reparations. You'll agree with me, my brother from Budunda was right here telling us how the community feels there's not been enough support from the powers that may be. Reparation is very key because during a catastrophe, there's destruction of property, there's destruction of lives. There are lots of things that are at stake. And people in the aftermath of this, for them to be able to cope, to adapt, there must be some deliberate effort to support them come to terms with what happened. And reparation is very broad here. It could involve, it can be symbolic. It involves things like compensation. Those people are crying for compensation. They're coming from a community where they're used to too much rainfall, all the time they're in their gardens. Now they're saying we're in a dry place and we need support. They need an apology as another form of reparation. There must be that guarantee of non-repetition, that whatever happened will not happen again. So some deliberate things must be done to guarantee, and one of them is reforming the institutions. Somebody mentioned right here and said there are people who are given jobs and they will never do their job because as you do your job, you're stepping on a toe somewhere. So there must be reform of such institutions so that people are given jobs and they deliver. There must be rehabilitation as another form of reparation. This rehabilitation can be physical, it can be psychological, it can be legal as well. So all those are very key pillars. And then lastly, memorialization. We've seen monuments erected in places where we've had mass graves and others. We've not seen any monument erected in memory of a landslide or something that happened. But these are very key reminders to the people that if we act unsustainably, if we behave unsustainably with the environment, what happened could happen again. So having such memorials and monuments are very key in helping societies come to terms with what happened to them. There are so many others that are very key, like physical repair. I talked about rehabilitation, which helps in healing the wounds. And these wounds can be physical wounds, but they can also be psychological wounds. Yesterday, Subi was very clear here how conflict, distractions is triggering trauma and exacerbating chances of PTSD and other mental health issues. So healing wounds through all those kind of interventions, physically, psychologically, is very key in helping communities come to terms with what happened to them. Building awareness. There's a lot of misinformation. There are lots of contested narratives. There are lots of things that are not clear in the communities out there. So there must be deliberate effort by TJ actors and other lead agencies mandated to do this work to ensure that there is proper awareness built. My brother made mention how people leave Bududa, come to Kiriandongo, go back to Bududa. No, there's a lot of unclear information there. Of course, having victims participate in such spaces, having victims share their opinions is another very key process that can help them come to terms with what happened to them. Reducing fear by forming them into support groups, empowering them, all those are very key interventions that can be taken on to help communities come to terms. But more importantly, there must be research and proper documentation. Most often when we talk about landslides, people run to Bududa. The mines quickly run to Bududa. But we've had landslides in so many parts of the country. But where is the data? How many people are affected? How many people are displaced? How many people need what kind of support? So we can have all this information if proper research and documentation is done. And this will help create that historical record that we can always refer to whenever we're moving on. As I wind up, ladies and gentlemen, TJ has been impacted a lot by climate change, and one of the areas that has been affected is peace and security. Like I said, Africa is dependent on rainfall, and whenever climate change occurs, production is affected, employment is affected, income is affected. People are forced to leave their homes where they would be actually engaged to move to towns, and most times they're unemployed and redundant. In case of any extreme group coming, mobilize them, they're easily mobilized. So there's that direct link that we realize that it will again take us to a point of conflict. It impacts directly on the different dynamics that drive the socioeconomic tensions and fuel the likelihood of these conflicts. You also realize that the arable land decreases due to the effects, for example, of bombing. When you go to Lamo in northern Uganda, there's a place called Agoro. It's a place where there was heavy bombing. And the communities say, even if you apply whatever amount of fertilizers, you'll never reap anything from that area. Leave alone that, there are places where up to now they're still having unexploded ordnances, and people even fear to use that kind of land. And this is directly linked to food security. People are not able to till their land, directly links to hunger and other things. Climate change is a human right. It has affected people's rights to health, rights to clean water, Because, like, for example, when a mudslide happens or a landslide happens, everything is distorted. Immediately people begin suffering from cholera and other opportunistic infections that come with those kind of situations. There is an increase in the prices of food, and due to absence of employment and other things, people have chosen to adapt. And how are they adapting? People are getting into charcoal production, people are getting into logging and other things. Of course, as I mentioned earlier, the massive death and destruction has that direct link to people's mental health. What do we need to do? You realize that the African Union policy I talked about earlier and the Uganda national TJ policy I talked about doesn't have, it omits to engage the issue of climate change directly. And these are policy documents that should come clear on some of the things that should be done to redress and ensure that we have accountability. We should also have efforts to acknowledge responsibilities, which allows communities to rebuild the trust, because whenever a catastrophe happens, there is that breakdown in trust. People begin to say, OPM hasn't done enough, government hasn't done enough, NEMA hasn't done enough, so-and-so hasn't done enough. So acknowledgement of responsibility by those different stakeholders rebuilds that trust and creates that legitimacy that is very, very important. As I mentioned earlier, we don't have any standard TJ approach that would say is directly applicable to climate change, but practitioners can tailor the different approaches into an overarching strategy to fit into the climate change context. So as I wind up, ladies and gentlemen, some of the things that can be tailored directly are reparation. Like I said, it has a lot of similarity with conflict. What affects people during conflict affects people during a disaster. Things like long-term support are very key, and they apply in both instances. And lastly, transitional justice. When the film was, the documentary was screened here in the morning, you heard people say the evil spirits that are attacking our children because of cutting certain species of trees, So there are so many traditional efforts that can be explored to see that some of these things are addressed and societies come to terms with their legacies. As you all know, TJ is both formal and informal. So all those formal processes, as long as they will bring reconciliation in the community, as long as they'll ensure that there's accountability, and eventually as long as they'll serve justice, are welcome and necessary steps to be taken under TJ. I thank you so much for listening to me. I will take my seat.
Wow. Thank you very much, Jimmy. A very, very powerful presentation from Jimmy. Let's give them another round of applause. I will dictate an organized one. Together we go. Jimmy, thank you very much. Jimmy leaves us at a very high note. His last words to quote were, "To move forward, we must first look back." Interestingly, in his presentation, Jimmy has rightly brought out that the African Union on Transitional Justice, the African Union on Transitional Justice Policy and the National Transitional Justice Policy, both policy documents, omit to directly engage with issues that relate to climate change. As actors, what do we do if this is lacking in our laws? And yet, still in the presentation, he rightly quotes for us that climate change is not only an environmental problem, but a public health issue, a threat to national security, but also an economic challenge. So it goes to say that From day one, we've been trying to highlight on these various points differently. How transitional justice affects, how climate affects transitional justice, how gender issues come into play, how the psychosocial well-being of a person comes into play. And Jimmy has rightly elucidated on these. Further, he mentioned the transitional justice pillars. These might be new to some of us. For instance, he mentioned prosecutions, truth-telling, memorialization. Who knew that these would be able to be in line with climate change? For instance, I like, Jimmy, when you mentioned that we have had several landslides in Uganda, but usually when we mention landslides, what we think about is Bududa first. But then he mentioned that as we help communities heal, we could look at memorialization, for instance. Could we set up a monument to remember that this has happened? Not forgetting that in order to enable communities heal, we need to enable them come to terms with what has happened in order to understand how to move forward. You have raised a number of recommendations, and I know that we've all been paying attention and we've taken keen interest in these. So I will not summarize everything you have said. Allow me to once again say thank you very much. It was a really, really wonderful presentation, and to open it up to our viewers, both online but also our physical participants. Any questions for Jimmy? I welcome right now before we move on to the second panelist. Do we have any questions? It was indeed powerful, so I agree if we are still digesting. As such, as we digest this, let's move on to the second panelist, who is none other than Professor Barnard Lututala, as earlier introduced. We'll be having a presentation. A video has been delivered for us, so let's get ready to listen to that. Thank you. Yes, let's just turn off the lights a bit and close the curtains so we could have a very clear picture of our panelist. Thank you.
I'm so happy to take the floor at this moment to talk about climate change as the change that will set many migratory changes in motion. First of all, I want to thank David and the organizer of this conference for giving me the opportunity to participate online to the conference, and I hope that this is the beginning of our collaboration between the centers of refugees in Kampala and the University of Kinshasa, where I'm teaching since 30 years now. The topic I want to talk about is very important, and I want to say only, let me say, 4 things, 4 ideas I want to put on the table for discussion. The first thing is that when I consider the title of my presentation, I think we must say that climate change is not the change that would set many migratory changes, but that is doing now and that will do in the future many migratory changes. It is not something we are trying to see or to do. It is something which is now on the table. We have done a study here in DRC, in Bazuele and Owele and Ituri, and about Bororo migrants. And what we have seen is that these Bororo migrants are coming to DRC as part of the consequences of climate change.
Thank you very much. That's the short video we had from Professor Barnard M. Lututala. I'll ask that the lights are turned on kindly and the curtains are opened. Thank you very much. So from Professor Barnard's very short presentation, he clearly sets out that climate change sets many migratory stories into motion, and this is something we agree with as stakeholders, as discussants, as people in this field. And he clearly stated that what we do now affects our tomorrow. So ladies and gentlemen, like the presentations have been echoing from time immemorial when this discourse started, but also from yesterday when we had this particular regional conference, what we do today affects our tomorrow. It's in our hands. So thank you very much, my panelists, Mr. Jimmy Wamimbi and Professor Barnard Lututala. I'll now open it up officially to my audience, online participants and my physical participants. Any questions for our panelists? As we think of the questions, could we just have a round of applause to the professor in absentia? An organized one. 1, 2, 3, we go. Thank you. I had a hand. Mr. Apollo, could you kindly help me with the microphone? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jimmy, for your thought-provoking presentation. I've been struck by the way the conversation has been running parallel. How do we bring justice for past wrongs? How do we right past wrongs has been the focus of what we call transitional justice. And this has been going on for many anthropogenic actions, war and violence mostly. And the whole focus has been, wrong has been done, which is anthropogenic in nature, and now people have been harmed. Now there is war-related harms of violence-induced harm, and how do we come to terms with our bitter past, our troubled past? How do we pack ourselves together as survivors of this violence and move forward? So that has been the transitional justice kind of discourse and practice on the one hand. We've also had now, for the last 2 days here, climate as changing, and yesterday's keynote, and as well as closing remarks, ended on the point that it is anthropogenic, and the consequences are already here. And we are seeing victims. The panel on the youth was the survivors panel, so to speak, survivors panel of climate change, hosts Ugandans as well as refugees. And we have been having this conversation as if they are on two separate lanes. A conversation about climate change, which is about the change looming, supposed to come, and yet we already have the victims and the survivors in the room. And we've also had a conversation about righting past wrongs as a backward-looking conversation. So transitional justice as backward-looking, climate change as forward-looking. And your presentation is now about to create the roundabout where a backward-looking conversation and a forward-looking conversation meet. Now, this is a very interesting moment for us. We've been hearing about transitioning to a greener, efficient, sustainable, clean And the embassy from the Netherlands yesterday told us actually about carbon neutral transition as the way forward. So my question to you and to the rest of us in the room is, how then do we envision a just and equitable transition to a clean energy that is going to repair, first of all, the ill or the harm done to those who have survived the brunt of climate change, and can help us to move forward in a much sustainable, longer run in the future?
Thank you very much for David. That question was really, really good. Any other questions? I think Jimmy would like to answer that, to respond to that as we wait for other questions.
Thanks, David, for first building that context and then bring the question that is really, really great. Like I rightly mentioned in my presentation, climate change is a defining issue at the point, and it's one that calls for concerted effort. You know, the conference of parties have done their part, but just like it was rightly mentioned here, there are small things that we ought to do and we're not doing at individual level. That if we all chose to have a clear eco footprint, then that is one of the avenues that we can exploit to ensure that we achieve that equitable future that we're looking forward to. So it's not a one-man's role. It's not something that is defined that it has to be a certain entity. It's a concerted effort, because we know the people, or countries, or entities, or organizations with that historical responsibility, you know, based on their production, the kind of energy they're using. But again, when it comes to, you know, being signatories to some of these international instruments, they're not, you know. So it's everybody's responsibility, right from those that are contributing the greatest to those that are actually